Some stories fade away with time. They become distant memories, small fragments buried in history books. But some stories refuse to disappear. They leave behind questions so disturbing that even decades later, people still whisper about them. This is one of those stories. In the winter of 1931, deep in the frozen wilderness of northern Canada, a mysterious man lived alone in the forest. He had no family, no known past, and no name anyone could confirm. The few people who had seen him described the same strange details. He rarely spoke. He avoided towns. And he lived farther into the wilderness than any other trapper dared to go. But in January of 1932, everything changed. A violent shootout with police would ignite one of the largest manhunts in Canadian history. For weeks, armed officers, dog sled teams, and even airplanes searched the endless snow-covered wilderness. They were hunting a man who moved like a ghost. A man who seemed to understand the Arctic better than anyone pursuing him. When it was finally over, the fugitive lay dead in the snow. But what investigators discovered next would turn the case into one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. Because the man they had hunted across the frozen wilderness did not seem to exist. No identity, no history, no records anywhere in the world. And to this day, no one knows who he really was. The Rat River Valley was one of the most isolated regions in North America. Endless forests stretched across the land. Frozen rivers cut through the wilderness like silent highways of ice. During winter, temperatures could drop to nearly -40 degrees. Only the most experienced trappers lived there. They survived by hunting animals whose fur could be sold for money. Life in this environment required incredible skill. You had to understand the land, you had to understand the animals, and most importantly, you had to respect the danger of the Arctic. One mistake in the wilderness could mean death. Most trappers knew each other. The communities were small. Everyone depended on cooperation to survive. So when a mysterious stranger appeared deep in the valley, people noticed. He had built a small wooden cabin far away from other settlements. Smoke could sometimes be seen rising from the chimney, but no one knew when he had arrived, and no one knew where he came from. Occasionally, other trappers would encounter him in the forest. The conversations were always short. The stranger avoided eye contact. He gave vague answers to simple questions, and he never revealed his real name. When people asked who he was, he simply ignored the question. Over time, rumors began to spread. Some believed he was hiding from the law. Others believed he had fled another country. And a few even wondered if he had killed someone before arriving in the valley. But no one had proof. The mysterious man continued living alone in the wilderness, until one day, something changed. Eventually, the strange reports reached the authorities. Members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police decided to investigate. 2 officers were sent to visit the trapper's cabin. The journey was long and difficult. Traveling through deep snow and frozen rivers took hours. But finally, they arrived at the isolated cabin. Smoke was rising from the chimney, which meant someone was clearly inside. The officers approached carefully. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked toward the door. One of them knocked. Once, twice. At first, there was no response. Then suddenly, a voice shouted from inside the cabin. "Go away! The officers looked at each other. The response was strange, but not illegal. Still, they needed to ask questions. One officer knocked again. This time, the voice inside sounded angry. "Leave now!" The officers decided not to force the situation. For the moment, they turned around and left. But they planned to return, because something about the stranger's behavior didn't feel right. And soon, their suspicions would prove correct. A few days later, the officers returned. This time, they brought more men with them. They intended to search the cabin. The group approached the small wooden building. Everything looked quiet. Snow covered the roof. Smoke drifted from the chimney again. The officers knocked on the door. No answer. They knocked again. Still nothing. Finally, one officer decided to open the door. The moment the door moved, gunfire exploded from inside the cabin. The mysterious trapper had been waiting, hidden behind furniture. He fired directly at the officers. The first shot struck one officer in the chest. He collapsed instantly. Another officer was hit in the arm. The rest scrambled for cover as bullets tore through the wooden walls. It was clear immediately. This was no ordinary trapper. The man inside knew exactly what he was doing. He fired with precision, and he had prepared defensive positions inside the cabin. After several minutes, the gunfire stopped. But when officers finally managed to enter the building, the trapper was gone. He had escaped into the wilderness. The hunt had begun. News of the killing spread rapidly. Authorities realized they were dealing with a dangerous and highly skilled fugitive. Soon, one of the largest manhunts in Canadian history began. More than 100 officers joined the search. Dog sled teams tracked footprints through the snow. Airplanes flew over the wilderness, scanning for movement. But the fugitive seemed to disappear into the frozen landscape. He traveled incredible distances through blizzards. He crossed frozen rivers. He moved silently through forests where visibility was almost zero. Tracking him became nearly impossible. At times, officers would discover signs that he had passed through an area. Footprints, a temporary shelter, or the remains of a small fire. But by the time they arrived, he was already gone. Weeks passed. The pursuit continued across hundreds of miles. Some officers began to believe the man had military training. Others believed he had lived in the Arctic for most of his life. Because surviving these conditions required knowledge that few people possessed. But eventually, the search teams discovered something important. Another cabin, hidden deep in the forest. And this time, the fugitive was still inside. The officers surrounded the cabin carefully. They called out for the fugitive to surrender. There was no answer. Then suddenly, gunfire erupted again. The trapper began shooting from inside the building. Bullets slammed into trees around the officers. The situation quickly became dangerous. Approaching the cabin was nearly impossible, so the officers made a shocking decision. They would destroy the building. Using explosives, they placed dynamite near the structure. The explosion ripped through the cabin, sending wooden debris flying into the air. Smoke and snow filled the forest. When the officers approached the wreckage, they expected to find the fugitive dead. But once again, he had escaped. The man had slipped away during the chaos, and the manhunt continued. Weeks later, the search teams finally cornered the fugitive near a frozen river. There was nowhere left to run. Witnesses later described the moment as strangely calm. The mysterious trapper stood alone in the snow, rifle in hand. He did not appear afraid. He raised his weapon, and the final gunfight began. It lasted only seconds. When it ended, the fugitive lay motionless in the snow. The long manhunt was finally over. But the greatest mystery was only beginning. Investigators searched the body. They expected to find identification, a passport, a letter, anything that could explain who the man was. But they found nothing. No documents, no records. Even his fingerprints failed to match anyone in police databases around the world. The man who had fought an entire police force across the Arctic had no identity. He became known forever as the Mad Trapper of Rat River. And nearly a century later, his true name remains unknown.